Thank you, Lord, for the the interesting man that walked into the space 5 years ago, somewhere like that. Father, and I just thank you, Lord God, for the journey and the process that you've pulled him into and pulled him on. And I pray, Lord God, that as he speaks, that you would speak through him. And Father, I pray that our ears will be open and our hearts will be open to your voice. Not Sam's voice, but your voice, God. And that as he speaks, that where we need to listen, change, that you, God, would speak through Sam, and that we'd listen and change and transform. Because we want to look more like you. We want to be more like you. Amen.
You'll excuse me if I'm sick. Well, I find I'm extraordinarily lazy.
I was wondering where that chair came from.
Yeah.
It looks like
extraordinarily lazy. And I find I can sit more easily than I can stand. That's the right height. So, I think I've opened up with this once before. The realisation is that I'm a numpty. And if anyone doesn't know that term, it's, I think, Scottish in origin, and it's someone who's well-meaning but foolish. And you can never call somebody you don't really like a numpty. You know, oh, what a numpty. But most of my life, I used to get really upset when I did things that only a numpty would do, or say something that only a numpty would say. And now that I suddenly realise that I am a numpty, it all makes sense. And so I'm really happy to say something that only a numpty would say, or do something that only a numpty would do, because it takes the pressure off. So if anyone's out there and you're finding randomly you're doing things that only a numpty would do, and say only one numpty would say, then consider perhaps you too
just maybe
are a numpty. So Doug, amongst his great wisenesses, and I think this wisdom was born out of experience, he said never preach on anything you don't know, you haven't gone through. And so I was asked to speak on discerning God within the scripture in Samuel. And so I've had to be ruthless with myself of what am I supposing or what am I knowing? What am I experiencing or what I have a culture of believing, because I live in a church environment. And it's been quite a ruthless process. And I've been stripped down, and the message gets, oddly enough, easier and easier. I've constructed this fabulous thing with overlaying of Matthew 7 and everything, and it just got blown out of the water. It's complete nonsense. Now, it's easy because everybody in here, I know, pretty much everybody hears God's voice, knows that they can hear God's voice, and they know when it is God's voice. But I just want to start, and sorry if I'm teaching my grandmother how to suck eggs, I'll go for it anyway, and I just want to lay the foundation. It's in John 10:3, Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. And the first time, I was a young man, 17, 18 maybe, and complete non-believer. And I think I've told some people this story before. I was spoken to in the night, and I knew it was Jesus. And how did I know it was Jesus? Didn't even believe in him. Or thought he was a historical figure or a nice man or a quasi-Buddhist or something. But I knew his voice. And the foundation is that everybody in here knows his voice. And everybody in this room, whether you know it or not, that's the point of it. Not that we're an elite little group and we can alone hear God's voice speaking to us. I mean, the first time, so I heard an audible voice, it was within me, but loud and outside. And the first time I really realised I knew that God was always with me, always speaking with me. I was travelling with horses, I talked about that before, and it was winter and I was down in South Cornwall somewhere, parked up the roadside, and really in the stress of agony of understanding why God is everything. And it was exactly the same as Elijah, where he's speaking and he said, I went to the mountain and I saw the wind and God wasn't in the wind and I heard are saying, where are you, God? And they're saying, I'm here. Where are you in the thing? I'm here. And then suddenly you realise that's you. You're here, and you've always been speaking to me. That realisation that that voice, that sense, that sensible voice of reason had always been there. So why do we have difficulties? If we have God's voice, we know the voice of Jesus. Why do we always have the difficulties of interpreting? And the foundation that this everything has to be laid on is our understanding of God. Now, when a lot of people say, like, God, Father, and get very disturbed because they have the sense that if God's going to speak to them, it's going to be maybe slightly condemning. Maybe it's slightly you're not doing quite well enough. Maybe it's always something that you want to slightly shy from. And when people have had fathers who have been flawed and have given words of lesson, encouragement, and when you needed hugging, didn't, when you this, that, I just, out of curiosity, I just wondered if it was worth trying an exercise in your own mind. Mm-hmm. So if you struggle to relate to God as Father, because of your own father, then just as an exercise, out of curiosity, imagine what a really good father would have been. I'm not talking about God, I'm talking about a physical father. Don't have to give him a face. But imagine what they would have said a real, perfect, ideal dad would have said if you had messed up and you needed support. Who, if you were doing something wrong, would gently put you right. Just, you can imagine, you could just spend time on your own, just as an exercise, to see if it does something. So if you are able, as a person, to imagine a perfect father, and our imaginations are limited because we're flesh, then how much more perfect must God be? You can't over-imagine God's goodness. You can't imagine more good than God. So if you can make a model that you can live and love and trust, then you're starting to make room for God as he is. And when we have God as he is, we're much, much more able to hear his voice and approach, because we don't think it's coming from a place that's going to bring us down. I mean, I love this. It's an easy one. It's a lovely man, Adrian Flowers, who writes, I think he's probably out of date now, but very English. And he just said basically he got to the point he couldn't cope with God is love and God loves you, because it was too big. It just went above his head. It didn't make any sort of, it's a sort of platitude almost. It didn't mean anything. And he got down to, God is nice and he likes you. And once he lives with that God is nice and he likes me, it's a really good place to be, to start to be able to hear a voice of a nice person that likes you. We'll struggle on through. So I have this image, and thank you, because you led into it beautifully. And an image that I have of trying to discern God's voice. You put yourself in a room, maybe somewhere in your home. For some reason, you've only got one room in your home. It's a big one in this image. And you're there, and the telly's on, and the window's open, and maybe there's a pneumatic grill outside, and the laptop's open, and everything's going. And you've got a shortwave radio. I don't even know these ones. You have to tune in. Like that, and you're trying to tune, you know, and there's make checks payable to holy, holy, holy abundance ministers. You know. Oh, going on 10 minutes, go back in. Oh, and you're trying to tune in this shortwave. So you're wanting to find, and we treat finding God's voice like something we have to examine deep, that God's voice is in there, and we have to, and you're twiddling around, and you're sitting back down on the sofa. Of course, what you don't realise, there's sat next to you all the time is God. And God isn't separate that we have to tune into. God is the most present thing in that room. Just there. And half the time, and talking quietly, talking whenever you need, answering every question. And then we've got the telly and the pneumatic drill and everything, and then we stand up and walk across the other wide room to address God, to speak outside of ourselves, to do something. And I think if I've got one thing to come away with from this, is learning. You know lovely Reuben, he's gone to be a youth pastor now in Salisbury. He had us all round to he was doing a worship thing. And there was only Reuben, and there was 3 other men besides me, all of us in our 50s, all very English. And Reuben, mate, I wish you hadn't done that. He got us all to hold hands, it was just excruciating. And mate, it was just, I'll let you get away with this. But I don't know, but I remember thinking, addressing God, I think, why am I speaking to God outside of myself and got such an electric shock? There wasn't, no electric to have an electric shock. Had such an electric shock, nearly dislocated my arm out my shoulder. And you know how electric shock, it's not actually painful, but it was a real shock. And I think the whole thing of if we can take anything, because we get lulled into a sort of religious thing, speaking to God outside ourselves. And so I've been talking back to the place that I hear. So I hear the voice of God, the guidance of God coming up from within me. And so I talk back into that place. And it's very close and it's different, and God's always present. Because, they know that 93, this is somebody who worked out, 93% of communication anyway isn't verbal. If you're sat with somebody and you're communicating with them, the word bit are minimal. Everything else that you pick up which is communicating is the timbre, their demeanour, the atmosphere, the feel, everything reading much more information than the actual words. So, for example, new immigrants in Australia, they have to teach them how to use the word bastard. Because Australians use bastard in every single imaginable, on the whole spectrum, from great endearment to outrageous insult. That same word, and all that cadence and all of that thing, and they have to teach them how to use that word and not get punched. And it's really quite subtle, so it's not the word. The 90%. So when it says we are made in God's image, I'm not entirely sure if that means arms and legs and eyes and ears. But I think it's like interface. It's language and humour and all those little subtleties. And that we plug exactly into God, emotion and everything. We're made in God's almost emotional image, that we are his children. And that this is where we communicate. So, sorry, there's all... And so, I have this thing, and this is something that so we have this sort of, why, if you're saying this very quiet voice, someone sat next to you, whose warmth you can feel, whose presence you can feel, whose large, an awful lot of that communication is non-verbal, that you're there. We're talking about a whole thing about young Samuel in the temple, and I'll just go over the story simply. With the little boy Samuel wakes up in the night and he hears he's being called Samuel, and he thinks it's Eli, the old priest. So he gets up and he runs to Eli, and Eli said, "No, it's not me, go back to bed." So he goes back to bed, and the second time, so he says to him, "Samuel," and he gets up and he thinks it's Eli, and he runs across to Eli, and Eli says, "No, it's not me, go back to bed." The third time it happens and he runs to Eli, Eli quits, and he goes back, and then Samuel speaks and gets an extraordinary revelation. And so that would seem to fly completely in the face of everything that I've just said. Didn't recognise God's voice, was very loud and outside of himself. But then we have to think, well, for whose purpose was it that they had to have this complete confusion? Why did this story have to happen in this way? And the reason, of course, it had to be for Eli's sake. Until Eli realised that Samuel was going to be spoken to by God, God kept having to send Samuel to him. And suddenly, and because there's no way that Samuel, the tiny little boy, could have gone up to his priest the next morning and said, I've got a prophecy for you. Eli sitting there on tenterhooks. Eli already knows what's coming, but he's on tenterhooks to hear it and will take it. And so an awful lot of the time, because we have amazing stories of people being spoken to by God audibly and other extraordinary things, but I believe, and it's not a hard and fast, is I believe that God generally only speaks loud as he needs to. And he needed to speak that loudly in that circumstance. And people whose lives I read about, amazing people who are used by God, will talk about a time when God spoke to them, or they had. But it was utterly crucial that they got that, because it was the life change. They don't get God audibly speaking outside of themselves when it's something like finding a parking space. You know, it's something absolutely. And also by that same token, I often believe that God doesn't speak more often than he needs to. Because I've had times in my life, as I know that you all have, you've been told very gently, very quietly about doing something, and you haven't. And then you get to the stage of thinking, oh, well, that was ages ago, I haven't heard about it, and I'm not hearing about it now, so presumably it's okay. I'll carry on doing it. And if you have any sense of God's voice, it's not repeating the same, it's I've already told you. We've had this chat. I'm just going to throw this in because it's such a nice picture. I don't know how well it adds. My mother only ever shouted at me once, I seem to remember, really loudly and with force. And that's because I was about to step into traffic as a little boy. But she also tells the story as when I was a tiny little dot. We lived in this house, and it was in the 1960s, and it was very, very rare for single parents then. My father was an artist and gone. He had 3 children. And we were given this amazing house to live in, 3 stories, I think quite cheap, by the cannibal. The cannibal used to rent it to us. And we used to get wildly excited because once a month the cannibal would come. Or the cannonball, we could never quite work it out. It turned out to be a bit, church. The cannibal didn't have the bones and the thing and the hair and the spear, but little dog collar with a lovely church with little crinkly eyes filled with the love of God, and it was the cannonball. So, but we never got over it. Anyway, the cannibal used to rent us this lovely house, and the top floor bit was a slopey roof that had windows sat outside of it. My mother said she was in the garden, and she could hear my voice in the garden, and that was odd. She knew I was upstairs in that little bit playing in the bedroom. And she looked up, and she saw that little boy of 4 or 3 sat right on the ledge over this sheer rock, happily talking to himself. And so she would get herself in the house and up the stairs, and she knew, had she said a single word, I might have turned round and slipped and be gone in front of her eyes. So she very quietly walked up behind me, put her arms around me, and pulled me in. And that's such a good image of how God might speak to you in trouble. But those sort of instances, the shout. So when you hear God loud, it means something. I think Mal, who we had teach us, had a very good, he sort of came to the conclusion that a lot of times if you had the real booming voice prophecy, the big one, the one that your life and this, a real meaty one, it's because you're going to have to hang on to that, because you're not going to get there. And I think maybe King David, Samuel comes up as an older man, and says, you're king. He might have gone to bed thinking, I'm going to wake up in the morning, and they'll take me up to the palace, and the concubines will be turning up by the truckload, and the 3D cakes on trays and everything. He spent the next part of his life being hunted for his life, trying to be murdered. But he hung on to that promise. So he was given that promise for that purpose. So, we needn't pine for. Because when we pine for the big word, the big thing, the everything like that, we're on the other side of the room. We're not necessarily sitting on the sofa with the presence and the quiet whisper, which is always here, always amongst us. And another sort of reason of that as well is discerning why are we not hearing God's voice really directive, really instructive. God, what do I do with my job? And I don't hear anything, really, very much. Who do I marry? More so. Just on that point, I'd pray for the first time in my life that I've been celibate, I've been single, I've been like that, but maybe I'd like to share my life with somebody. And this girl ran past 5 minutes later, and an audible voice, I think an angel, said very clearly, that's her. And that's Kate who I've been with from that moment to this one, 31 years or something. So insignificant, but a lot of things I want to do, what do I do, God, what do I do? And it's just not telling us, which is really unfair. And the only sort of reason that I get when I think about this is that we are made free. This is the reason Jesus says, that you will be free and free indeed. My truth will set you free. And we have now freedom. And so if you take a small child, a very, very insecure, frightened little child, to a play park, and they're swings and roundabouts and ball pools and sand pits and everything you can want to do, and they cling on, what do I do? Well, you enjoy it. You just try it all out. This is an amazing planet we live in. You try it all out, do what you want. When Saul, King Saul, and that's in Samuel, I wrote it down so you can actually cross-reference it. I seem not to have. I think it's 1 Samuel 10. First thing that God says to Saul, do what you want, and I'll bless it. And there's an awful lot of that choice that we got in our life, and we're desperate and desperate and desperate to God to prescribe every little step that we take. And so finally he'll relent and say, you can go on the slide. And we go on the slide for hours till we've worn out our little shorts, lifted bum poking through the holes. It's we have freedom, and a lot of our purpose is to be educated in righteous decision. It's to be educated in decisions that are right with the information that we got. And I think it's really important at this point that we're not told every single step, or it's not your walk. I mean, yes, in crisis, yes, there's no hard and fast, but a lot of it is we're required to exercise decision. So you see the person in need. Do you have to go to God and say, God, do I do anything? Because we know we're being exercised in having our heart changed. God gives you the desires of your heart. I don't think that means the desires of this corrupt thing that we have, but the impulses that we start to develop in our heart are God-given. And we exercise those. That's why we have free choice, to exercise them or not to exercise them. So half the time, an awful lot of our life, we're not being told very, very specifically, you must do this, you must go here, you mustn't go there. We know, we've got the imprint, we've got the word, we've got so much surrounding. And we also do have the conviction of the Spirit. So, I suppose when you're talking about discerning the voice, discerning God, then we also go back into, well, what are the other voices that we're hearing? And there are so many other voices, and I think, the good ones. I know that angels do speak. I'll just tell you one story, and I think I've told it before, but I'd had a very, very unpleasant encounter with somebody who manifested an evil spirit. And I wasn't, up to that point, that was all academic, it didn't actually exist. And when it actually existed, I remember being quite disturbed. And I was on my own in the dark. And I was saying, well, if that exists, then all of that about angels must be true. So I have angels in my presence. So, okay, if you're here and you're around me, tell me something about myself that I don't know. And someone started to speak and was interrupted by someone else who said in a comically golden voice, "Your flies are undone." And I was sort of expecting some deep psychoanalysis. And I thought, well, that's not very angelic. Besides which, my flies are. Oh, they are. And there was laughter. I just heard that, you know. And so the angelic is good, but then we have the other things. And the point of it, how do we discern? And to be honest with you, I think it's pretty simple. I don't think it's nearly as hard as we would like to or pretend to acknowledge. Because when we know that we're not apart from God growing towards God, when we know that we're in God's hand to start with, and we're growing to God's hand, then, and we know what the reason and purpose for God in our life is transforming us from glory to glory, from flawed and bitter and resentful and spiteful and greedy and vain and all these things that we are. That all the things that God will tell us is moving us to that freedom and that fulfillment. So a lot of the time, that's why I think a lot of the time he's not particularly bothered necessarily what job we do. Do what job you want and I'll bless it. Do what you want and I'll bless it. But I'm much more interested, not in the job that you do, but how you behave between that junior person you're responsible for at work, who's being disrespectful and making your life hell. I'm much more interested to know how you do that. So the voices we know from God are always moving us towards that. And the voices that we know aren't from God, are either from our own selfish desires or somewhere else, are always moving us to self-righteousness, to I am right, I don't want to forgive because I'm right. And this confirmation voice, you're right, how dare they? And it's not rocket science, and we know, and we pretend that we don't really know that that's God. You know, is that God telling you that? We know. It's not hard. We know his voice. His sheep know his voice. It's not a difficult thing. We lie to ourselves. I'm very good. I'm speaking from experience. I adore nicotine, as you all know. And I smoke and I don't smoke and I do smoke. But ask somebody who's giving up smoking, what voices they hear then? Boy, you hear them. Boy, you hear them. Somebody said something mildly upsetting to you 3 days into you giving up. Oh, I'm so upset. I'm going to have a cigarette. And it's all their fault. And then you really don't have to have a cigarette. It's nothing, and you're making it. And these things. But the point of it is that we're in God's hand. We're next to God. We're closer than that picture of being really close and hearing a small voice. And we can hear when we want. And if we don't hear the words of instruction, we always hear the words of affirmation and comfort. Every time. How many times have you heard it in this room this morning? Those words of affirmation and comfort, of belonging, of being taken to somewhere really wonderful, and more things that we let go of. So, in conclusion, we're surrounded by God and his presence, his person. 93% of it isn't necessarily verbal, but everything around us is communicating. And God isn't a shortwave radio that we need to tune into, or somewhere out that, or some arrival, a letter through the letterbox. But God is right next to us, and what we need not to do is stand up and proclaim to God and sit back down. I mean, I always have this feeling nowadays that faith, I used to treat faith like a mountain I had to climb up. And now I think faith is a comfy chair I sit in. And I really want to sit in that comfy chair with that presence. And so if there's any instruction, anything that I'm being told myself. It's turn the telly off, shut the window, turn off the shortwave radio, and sit back down and snuggle up. Because I wonder if it's not much better to hear God's heartbeat and even to hear his voice.